But let me ask you about this, and this is in Axios this morning. This is about the Inflation Reduction Act and specifically about EVs and all of the tax incentives and tax credits that have been built in. There is now an estimate that says it's literally, and this is not inflation. This is it's four times the cost because of the number of folks that are going to benefit from it and are they taking advantage of it. The good news is they're taking advantage of it. The bad news is the math is going to be a lot more expensive, which raises the question of actually whether the incentives needed to be as high as they are.
Well, we know that there's a shift toward electric vehicles. That would probably have happened with or without us. But there are three things that would not have happened on their own that we have to shape with policy. One, is that electric revolution going to be made in America? And that's why these incentives were shaped in a way that encourages U.S.-based manufacturing and production of these cars. It's in line with the president's extraordinary record of creating 750,000 plus manufacturing jobs in the U.S. And as a child of the industrial Midwest, growing up in what used to be a company town for the Studebaker auto manufacturing company in South Bend, Indiana, certainly something that means a lot to me. So one, making sure it's made in America. Two, making sure it happens quickly enough to help us meet our climate goals. You want to talk about things that are expensive, the destruction of lives and property by allowing any outcome to happen even just a minute later than it should have in terms of a climate win is enormous. And then third, making sure that it's accessible and available to everybody. Like any early technology, the early adopters of electric vehicles were people with a lot of means, a lot of resources. But this is something that needs to get quickly mainstreamed, especially when you consider that the Americans who stand the most to benefit from having an EV are lower income Americans who are paying a higher share of their family budget on gas prices. The question is, given the trends, as you said at the top, and just how quickly people are taking this up, if the trends already existed, are we going to look back 2, 3, 4 years from now and say, you know what? We didn't need to provide those incentives. They were going to happen either anyway, or maybe the incentives were just too large. When you look at Tesla, they're going to record credits, for example,
or tax incentives of $1 billion in a year.
Yeah, so if we didn't care whether the EV revolution was going to be led by China, if we didn't care whether or not U.S. manufacturers with high labor standards were going to be at the cutting edge, then I guess we could have not bothered with the incentives and seen how that played out. If we didn't care about the pace of it, right? And if we said, look, these will happen sooner or later, but if these climate wins come a few years later and that warming happens just a little quicker and a few more people die because of that,
Mr. Secretary, I'm not making
that's
that argument.
why we have policy interventions.
Let's pivot the conversation from the ground to the skies, because talk about criticism. There's been criticism both of the FAA, which obviously is in your world, as well as airlines like Southwest. And I'm baffled as to where we are, because I know we've had these conversations now for many months, probably the past year, about problems in the skies, and yet we have not resolved them. And there is a lot of frustration. So I know you've talked about holding the airlines accountable, holding the FAA accountable. What are you actually doing at this point?
Well, our focus is getting results for consumers. So, for example, with the frustrations we've seen over the last years with cancellations and delays, we took a lot of steps over the summer that won more benefits for passengers in terms of enforceable requirements on getting your expenses covered, getting a voucher for a meal or a hotel when you get stuck. Things that came in handy, by the way, during this Southwest debacle. Until we got those customer service agreements that, again, are enforceable by our department, we won that progress over the summer. Inch by inch. Until we had that, there was really no ability to enforce on those things. We're looking at other steps that we can take, including rules that are going to basically toughen and strengthen that, since we've already made a lot of updates, basically finding new ways to use our existing authorities to take care of passengers. But, of course, we're going to continue doing everything we can, including following up on all the complaints about Southwest. But
what
airlines need to do what they can to take care of
What else can you do within your own purview, and what kind of potential legislation? I mean, can you imagine legislation? We were talking to one of the CEOs of one of the airlines earlier this week just about the Bill of Rights that exists, for example, in Europe. And whether that is a path to pursue or not to pursue. As you might imagine, the airlines don't like that.
They don't, but we've got to look at ways to continue making for a better passenger experience. And so I think everything has to be on the table. Some things we can do with the authorities that we have. We're pursuing those aggressively with a small but mighty team. We have about 15 lawyers and 15 analysts in our consumer protection shop doing everything from rulemakings for and enforcement for passengers with disabilities to following up on thousands of complaints about Southwest Airlines to preparing regulations on ancillary fees. But I think this is also a good time for that conversation to happen in Congress. We've got FAA reauthorization coming up, so aviation is going to be on everybody's mind on Capitol Hill. And look, we've had a business model that has seen more and more consolidation, more and more, for lack of a better term, nickel and diming. And if this is the direction that airlines are going to continue moving in, we've got to make sure that the backstop gets tougher and tougher. Last year, we set a record, an all-time record for civil penalties assessed against airlines for violations. What we'd rather see, of course, is a high standard of service in the first place, so people don't need to come to us and complain, and we don't need to issue those fines. Right. But we're going to do it if that's what it takes. And I think both on our end and on the legislative side, you're going to see more proposals and more steps that I think, by the way, are perfectly consistent with airlines doing well as businesses, but not on the backs of a miserable passenger experience.
No, but I think what I'm suggesting, we actually had a segment in the last hour where we were talking about some of the fraud and abuse and waste that came from some of the PPP loans and the like. And I remember a period of time where people said, you know what, we just got to get the money out as quickly as humanly possible to as many American citizens as humanly possible. And you know what, there might be some lost along the way. And that's just going to be the cost of doing business. I think what and today, of course, there's finger pointing several years later. What I'm suggesting, or at least raising the question with you, is here we are at a moment, and I don't disagree with you. I think we all want to move the EV revolution along as fast as we humanly can. But it's also possible 2 or 3 years from now that people will finger point and say, were these incentives necessary, or were the incentives, as designed as perfectly as they could be?
Yeah, look, remember, I cut my teeth as a mayor. And one thing that mayors think a lot about, governors think a lot about, is these economic development packages where you offer to do the utility work or something to prepare a site, maybe a tax break, because you really want to land that big factory or get that big employer to come over. And one question you ask yourself is, by definition, the first penny of incentive more than what was required to make something happen, by definition, is wasted, or at least it's captured from the taxpayer by the beneficiary of that incentive in a way that doesn't meet your policy goal. And even the best due diligence in the world can't pinpoint where that first penny begins. I think one thing you did see, of course, especially in those early days of COVID response, was the country very much on an emergency footing, and policymakers understanding that this might not be the kind of policy design that if you had 10 years to think it up would be perfect, but we had to save the economy. I think in this case it is different. We still have a sense of urgency. We still have obviously a clock ticking in terms of climate, in terms of the economic race with our global competitors. But I also think we have had the space to design these kinds of incentives. Well, one other thing I think is really important to point out, especially on the charging piece, we have a ton of flexibility in terms of the states leading the way on their individual charging plans, precisely because nobody can say at the outset before you even go in what the optimal subsidy is to make sure a charging network works. Some of them are going to focus more on capital. Some of them are going to focus more on O&M. And the policy is designed for us to see what works and adjust fire as we go.
Related to this, I'm curious, I don't know if you saw this news this morning. It's unrelated to you personally, but it's something that I imagine you might have a view on, which is BP. The oil company, which has tried to be more about clean energy in recent years. The CEO recently saying, you know what, we're going to actually change strategy. We might have actually gone too far on the ESG side of things. We need to kind of pull it back. I'm curious what you think of that, and I think we're starting to see that across the board, given that so much of what the administration is trying to do is at odds with it. Well,
look, I think a lot of these companies are deciding what are they fundamentally. Are they fundamentally energy companies, or are they fundamentally petroleum companies? And the way you answer that question, I guess, drives their business strategies. What I know in terms of our national strategy is that we've got an economy that needs to be powered in a way that is effective and efficient and affordable for Americans. And we also have a very clear and present climate threat that requires us to prepare for the next few years in a very different way than how we did the last 100. I mean, I've had this on my mind because of the infrastructure work we're doing. Announcing tunnels and bridges we're working on that are literally 100+ years old. And the mentality has to shift. Not sure, it's obviously not my place as transportation secretary to organize how those companies make those choices, but as a policy matter, we're going to keep making sure that we have the right kind of
but let me ask you this, related to those,
that's climate friendly.
Related to those choices for oil companies specifically, because the other thing the administration, the White House, has been very vocal about is their frustration with oil companies pursuing buybacks and dividends at a time when there have been record profits. In Europe, there have been windfall taxes. The question here is this all theater here in the United States? Is there is there something more meaningful happening between sort of finger pointing on both sides?
Well, as you know, the president, for example, has called for use it or lose it policies because you have seen a lot of these energy companies basically sitting on capacity, the ability to use more of these leases and permits that they have. They're not doing it because, of course, when prices are high, including when prices are high because production could be higher, they're doing perfectly fine. That's exactly why the president has taken steps to, first of all, be clear with the American people about how we got here, and also to use the policy tools we do have, whether it's ethanol flexibility, the petroleum reserve, whatever it takes to get some relief for Americans at the pump. And obviously, we've seen a lot of relief compared to the peak of where gas prices were, but still a lot of pain at the pump. Long term, we're looking at profound changes to how we energize this country. But one pattern that we're definitely seeing, whether you're talking about the energy sector or the transportation sector, is you've got choices that have been made in boardrooms that are leading to not just reasonable profit or even impressive profit, but spectacular profits being made at the very same time that Americans are struggling or suffering because of some of the consequences of underinvestment. And then you got some people here in Washington trying to blame the government. And, that's a pattern that's at least as old as I've been alive. But we're going to keep working to actually make sure people are better off.